Hello, everybody. Pam here from the Dick Biondi Film. I'm here with a couple of special people today. I hope everybody's doing good out there. Hope everybody's healthy and not getting too stir crazy. And we're here to try to bring some fun and a little lighthearted entertainment to you today. We're going to talk about WLS and Dick Biondi and rock and roll. So get ready. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to Joe Farina. He's our Director of Communications and Marketing. Joe, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Wonderful to be with you and with everybody tonight. Hope everybody's staying healthy and safe. And we appreciate everybody out there joining us tonight. We have an incredible guest tonight, a very, very talented DJ and a very, very talented author. Scott Childers is joining us tonight. The name of the book, and I want to make sure I get this correct, is Chicago's WLS Radio 1924 to 2007. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an all-around good guy, talented guy, Mr. Scott Childers. Scott, how you doing tonight?
Hi, Joe. Good to see you. Good to see you, Pam. And good evening to our audience tonight. Hopefully everyone is staying safe, as we say. I know that's starting to become a cliche, but of course we do want to make sure that everyone does stay happy and healthy. That is very important. You're absolutely right.
That's right. So Scott, we're going to talk about WLS. Remember back in 1960. And actually, I'd like you to go back and tell the audience what it was like to listen to rock and roll in Chicago before May 2nd, 1960. Right.
Well, actually, to listen to WLS before May 2nd, 1960, you would have heard a lot of farm programming. The station was originally owned by Sears back in 1924. That's why the call letters stand for World's Largest Store, because at one point, Sears was the world's largest store. And they set up their broadcast from the Sears Tower, not the 110-story Sears Tower, but the one that was located on Holman Avenue, which is actually still there, up on the 11th floor of the Sears building. And they started with some experimental broadcasts. And the reason that the station was put together back in those early days, we're talking 1924, that really is the dawn of radio. The whole idea was that the station was a service to the farmer, because they realized that the farmer, especially here in the Midwest and across America, how important they are. Boy, we certainly know that these days, don't we, with all that's going on.
For sure.
So it really wasn't considered a commercial venture per se to begin with, but the idea was that they would earn the trust of the farmer, and they did it honestly. It wasn't a ruse or anything along those lines. They were on the level. And in turn, the farmer trusted not only the radio station, but also the Sears catalog, because that's really the Amazon of our day today. Where did the farmer get all of their equipment? Where did they get all of their, we'll call them electronics, but let's say radio equipment back in those days, generally out of the Sears catalog. And as well, their homes and everything was in the Sears catalog. So Sears owned the station for about 4 years, and then they realized they're more of a retailer, not a broadcaster. Plus, they were having some issues getting some advertising from some competitors. So they sold the station to a company called The Prairie Farmer, which is a Prairie Farmer magazine, which is a periodical to the farmer, also located on the west side of Chicago. And pretty much from 1928 to 1960, WLS was the station to listen to in the Midwest as far as farm news, as far as down-home entertainment, polite entertainment, you may remember those terms, and it was the place to go. By the time we got to the 50s, well, a lot of that entertainment was a little passé, and the city became much more cosmopolitan, and rock and roll started knocking on the door. So let's say we go back to the dawn of rock and roll, 1955 to 1956. You probably wouldn't hear an Elvis record on WLS, but you might hear it at night on WGN, and you certainly would hear it on WJJD, which was AM 1160, or even on WIND, which was AM 560, because they programmed rock and roll music at night. And it wasn't until ABC purchased the Prairie Farmer WLS that they turned the station rock and roll. And the reason they did is because the program director, Sam Holman, did the same thing at a station in Pittsburgh at KQV. And once he was successful to that, the ABC bosses realized we got to get a hold of the 50,000 watt blowtorch and change this thing to rock and roll. Let's start moving along. So once they brought in Sam, that's when they started to bring in all the new disc jockeys that were going to be on the station beginning in May. And that included a host of great personalities that we got to know later on, which included Dick Biondi. He was one of the Swingin' Seven as well. And Dick tells a story about, so May 2nd was a Monday, and over the weekend, Bob Hale and Dick Biondi were at the station, and after midnight, when they would usually turn the station off, they left the station on, and they started playing Elvis records and having a good time on there. And people started flooding the switchboard saying, what's going on? What's going on? Because they didn't know who Dick Biondi was or who Bob Hale was. So that weekend, they actually got a little bit of a dry run in. And then on Monday, May 2nd, 6 a.m. was the time. The sounds of Alley Oop were on the radio, the Hollywood Argyles, and that's what started what is really considered the contemporary music period. Rock and roll kind of kicked in a little later. It was a little slow there in the early 60s, but then things started to speed up from there. So amazing how that worked, and that meant that WLS was the first radio station in Chicago to program rock and roll or contemporary music 24 hours a day.
That's amazing. I mean, the history of WLS, the history of Chicago and radio, Dick Biondi, is sensational. I think it's personally so unique. And before I get to my question, I just wanted to tell everybody that Scott is actually, he's in our film. He's in the Dick Biondi film documentary. We had the pleasure of interviewing Scott for our documentary, and it's just fantastic. And Scott, you touched on it a little bit during these last few minutes. Can you talk about the cultural impact that Dick Biondi and WLS had, socially, culturally, in broadcasting? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And, not to take away anything from stations like WGN, which was a huge radio station as well, in its lane, but WLS really made their own lane because that lane was not there before. We had radio stations that had full orchestras that would play country and western, that would play easy listening music. Maybe they would play, whether it's country music, what we would consider country music, or even later on the R&B stations, but a mass appeal pop radio station that was on the air 24 hours a day. Before they started, nobody had done that because they were there, essentially at the beginning. I mean, really, they only missed the mark. If you want to call the official start of rock and roll era 1955, they only missed the mark by 5 years. That's pretty good. And a lot of people remember the big radio battles between WLS and WCFL. But one of the things you do have to remember is WCFL didn't switch to rock and roll. They were a jazz station and spoken word during the day. They did news and some talk until 1965. So WLS already had a 5-year lead on them. And then they left the format in 1976 to leave WLS as the only AM rock and roll station, which they continued on all the way to essentially till 1989. And with 50,000 watts coming out of the Tinley Park transmitter that not only blanketed the Midwest, but over 38 states here in the U.S. at night, as well as into Europe and into South America and Canada. It is a huge, huge radio station. And a lot of care was taken for the songs that were played on the radio station and those who presented the songs. Joe, you had mentioned about how Dick Biondi was so different than everyone else because he needed to appeal to the teens. Because when you think about his on-the-air shift, that was 9 to midnight. Well, 9 to midnight at night, mom and dad are either watching television or back in the 60s, they may be reading or they may be taking care of the housework. where the teens, with the ones with the transistor radio under the pillow, they're the ones that were listening to Biondi. So he had to be a little more outrageous. I like to say Dick Biondi took it to 11, if we can quote Spinal Tap. Because you think about Bob Hale, who worked east of midnight. We had Sam Holman, who was on the air, Ed Grennan, and Mort Crowley. If you go back and listen to their presentation, it was very smooth, it was very professional. But when it came to Biondi being on the air, that's when the yelling and the screaming started, because he knew he needed to grab that audience, and that's the way he did it. And in addition to that, he's also responsible for so many people getting into the business that I'm in. And here's how I find this domino effect interesting. Because when Biondi was on from 60 to 63 at WLS, who were the kids that were listening that wanted to be on the radio? It was the Bob Surratts and the Tommy Edwards and the Jeff Davises, to name a few just from WLS. By the time I got interested in the 70s, I was listening to the Bob Surratts and the Tommy Edwards and the Jeff Davises and the Larry Lujaks, and it went down the line and down the line, and that's how the dominoes went. So it just shows, number one, how influential the radio station was, and number two, just how influential Dick Biondi was. And this is just the listeners. We haven't even covered artists and musicians.
Pam, I believe you might want to unmute. Somehow Pam's on mute. Let's unmute Pam.
There you go.
We need to hear your voice.
Well, I unmuted everybody except myself. Okay. Well, I remember being there, and I was about 12, I think, in 1960, and I remember tuning in the Farm Report. Don't ask me why I was listening to the Farm Report, but that's what I was doing. I remember turning on WLS and hearing rock and roll music. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? You know? And then, of course, when Biondi came on at night, that was it. I was so hooked. And all of us kids went wild. I mean, we just couldn't get enough because, like you say, there was no rock and roll really 24 hours a day, and there was no Biondi, that's for sure. So
now, Pam, let me ask you this question. Pam, what did your parents listen to?
They listened to WIND a lot. I know that. And
now,
I
WLS listeners during the farm era, did they listen to that, or were they?
Yeah, they listened to WLS too, obviously, because I was listening to it. Yeah.
Right,
absolutely.
because you need to go to that dial position, and then when you found something completely different that had never been there before,
yeah.
My guess is that you probably either got on the phone or at school the next day you said to your friends.
Oh, I was on that phone like a rocket.
Exactly, yeah. And
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, the
In
word.
fact, you know, kids probably don't remember this, but when our favorite song came on the radio, we were calling our friends, turn on WLS. Vicki Nelson's on, you know, it was a big deal to hear your song on the radio.
Right.
Oh my gosh, because, to buy records, you had to really, they weren't that expensive, but, we're getting 25 cents a lot, at least I was, 25 cents a week allowance, and a record costs $1. So you didn't buy that many records. So it was a big deal to hear your favorite song, and especially if Biondi played it.
And, when you heard him, you probably, and both of you could probably, say the same thing, whether you heard him live or maybe you heard him later on. He didn't sound like anyone else.
No way. He was so unique. He was booming out of that mind. The thing I loved about Biondi was he was like a big kid, and you just knew he was having a blast. And you were having a blast with him. And the kids just ate it up.
That is very important. I've had many programming bosses that I've worked for in my 35 years on the radio, and being a programming director myself. And I've always been told, and I've always passed it on to the people that worked for me, that if you're having a good time, then the audience is having it.
They know it. They can feel it.
Exactly right. It's joining the party. It really is joining the party.
And you know what Dick did? He just absolutely had a love for that music, whereas a lot of disc jockeys at that time didn't really care for that rock and roll. They were like, I'll play it, but it's not my bag. Biondi loved it. So
and that's how I got into Dick Biondi. Is my generation would specifically be the Magic, the WJMK.
Right.
And I remember listening to him, and this guy is energetic. He's enthusiastic. He was nothing like I heard on the radio. And I already grew up being a rock and roll music fan. And then when I started listening, to his show on a regular basis, I mean, the type of music that he would play, and he was almost like a historian as well. And you could tell that he was really into the music that he was playing. And from WJMK, I kind of went back, said, okay, I'm going to find out and learn a little bit more about the history of Dick Biondi. And when I learned about his time at WLS and WCFL and so forth, and then playing the Beatles record for the first time in the U.S. and being there during the advent of rock and roll, British invasion, and so forth, it just, my appreciation and admiration for him just went to, as you said, Scott, it went to 11. It went to just another level. And and that's how, I became a fan of Dick Biondi and his work and his history.
And I think a lot of that credit goes to him about being authentic too. Again, it's something we talk about in our business a lot is, maybe you've only got 7 to 10 seconds to talk over a song, but it takes a lot more to edit yourself down and make sure what you say is effective and punches through. But when you do have a few more seconds to talk, because it's never minutes, it's seconds, you want to be as authentic as possible. And I think one of the things that he did, and a lot of the early jocks at WLS, is that they weren't card readers. That is a terminology we used in our business where somebody would say, hey, it's 5:32 and Janet is listening on the West Side. Thank you, Janet. And then they throw the card back and then they go, hey, it's 6:03. Hi to Jimmy. He's listening in Norwich. Hi, Jimmy. And there's no authenticity in that because it wasn't really real. It was written down for them. And there is a difference from being authentic as opposed to somebody who is a card reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Big difference.
Now, Pam, why don't you tell us a little bit about the first time? One of the things that a lot of the jocks in the 60s, and it certainly was not limited to WLS, but a lot of pop and rock stations around the country, and even up to today, we do kind of the same thing, but it's a little different. We didn't have the internet then. We didn't have social media. I mean, we barely had video when you think about television. So the only way that you could interface with your favorite personality is, number one, by listening on the radio, but number two, it was to come and see them live. And a good way for them to make a little extra money was to do the record hops. And they would get out and do these record hops where they essentially would go out and play music for 2 to 3 hours at a dance. Maybe it was at a church, maybe it was at an auditorium. And that was also your opportunity to come out and see the big stars, which were our disc jockeys.
Absolutely. And I went to a lot of those sock hops. And when I started my fan club for Dick, I would go out to these different places. I'd go down to the WLS studios on Saturday when they opened it up for kids. I'd go wherever Dick was doing a remote, or even a special appearance like at record stores and all kinds of places. And then also his sock hops. And I would write about it in my little newsletter and hand deliver it to kids at school. I was in junior high. And it was just such a big deal for me, it was a lot of fun. It was very exciting because Dick, got to know me, and he would, if there was a band playing that night, I'd get to meet the band, and it was, oh my gosh, it was rock and roll history being made. I was having a blast. But yeah, those little sock hops, the kids, they had a chance to come out and meet Dick. I remember going over to Immaculate Conception School right here in Elmhurst, and Dick was up on the stage. Back in the gyms, they had these big tall stages, and Dick is leaning down like a rock star over crowds of kids. He's shaking hands with everybody. And they were there to see him. They weren't there to see the band as much as him. They loved this guy, It was exciting. It really was.
I remember that one of the disc jockeys had made a comment about, especially when Beatlemania broke out, and I know that Dick had already gone to Los Angeles by that point, and there's so many stories we could tell about that. But I do remember Ron Riley, who ended up replacing Dick in that 9 to midnight shift when Beatlemania broke out, and he would say that these sock hops were always so well attended for those reasons that you had mentioned, and that the disc jockeys at that point, they actually got to meet the Beatles. They were up in the hotel rooms and they got to meet them, and the disc jockeys became the stars because the listeners did not have access to these big acts like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, but they did have access to the disc jockeys like
That's right.
Beatles and all the others. So they became the stars in between.
Right. And they were the ones playing all the music and telling all the latest news about the Beatles or whoever, whatever band, and they were the liaison between these musicians and the soundtrack of our lives, really. And it was just very exciting and very different back in those days. I don't think kids would really understand what it was like.
It was, and I think you have to think about the audience, how much bigger the audience was then, because we didn't have all the different entertainment outlets we have now. I mean, think about, here we are, we're on Zoom, on the internet, we have all of our social media, Facebook and Instagram, and so on and so forth. We have 300 cable TV channels. Now we also have all the streaming services that we didn't have before. Even broadcast television, has gone from, as we always used to like to say, 2, 5, 7, and 9. There are at least 30 television channels now, and radio stations are the same thing. And when a station now gets an audience share of about 5 or 6%, that is huge. That is a huge share for these days. When you go back to those days, they were pulling at night. Dick Biondi was pulling about 70%. That is unheard
Isn't that unbelievable?
Unheard of.
Everybody was listening. You could walk down the street without a radio, and I did this. And the cars going by and people on their front porches with their radios, they all had Biondi on. You could listen to his show.
You didn't even have to have the radio, right?
No. It was wild. It really was. It was a wild time.
That's amazing.
I'm so lucky that I grew up in it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I hear my parents growing up, during that area. Both of my parents were baby boomers, and when they told stories of, how they grew up and what they listened to, just the overall, culture of growing up in Chicago, during, the 50s and 60s, such a unique time. And at times, it's almost like you want to go into a time machine and go back to that era and relive it, because it is really a special, unique time. And that brings me to my next question, and I can direct this to both of you, really. If you could talk about Dick Biondi when he played the first Beatles record in the U.S., and I leave that open to Pam and Scott to talk a little bit about that.
It's pretty interesting. Pam, you want to go ahead first? Since
No, you go ahead.
It's interesting when you think about that, because at that point, the Beatles were beginning to get big in the UK. And obviously, being from England and being from Liverpool, that's where they started. But they had a hard time getting started here in the U.S. We're talking late 62 into 63. So, and when you really think about Beatlemania in America, that really didn't happen until 1964. But what happened is that they had a very difficult time here in the U.S. securing a record deal. Now, in England, they were on Parlophone, which was a subsidiary of EMI. Now, that subsidiary here in the United States, as many people will know who are record collectors, is Capitol. Capitol Records was the U.S. EMI. However, they took a pass. They said, no, we're not into this. Because you have to remember, at that point, their sound was, again, very similar to Dick Biondi's sound. It was different than what we had heard before. And it took a little time for American audiences, perhaps, to acclimate to that. But it also took time because they were not available on a wide venue. So rather than them being on a major label, such as Capitol, or perhaps even at that point they could have been on Columbia or several other labels, they ended up having all of their early songs released on very small independent labels, Parrot and Tolly, and then here in Chicago, they were released on VJ, which was mainly an R&B label. And so they gave them a chance, and once it started to take off, then Capitol came in and said, "Oh, hey, we better take this back." So they actually purchased that back. They purchased the contract back from VJ Records on on South Michigan Avenue, and so when that song got out, they worked the record as they usually do, which is that you will have a record promoter come to the radio station each week, bringing 5 or 6 or 10 records, depending on how many they have, or how the music director, how he's feeling that week, and how many he wants to sit through. So they brought it in and they played it, and they thought that was okay. We'll give it a spin or two and see how it works out. And generally, new songs like that usually debut either in the evening or in the overnight hours, because during the day, when you have the highest concentration of the adult buying public, people are actually buying items, they're gonna keep those songs very familiar, so people know exactly what they're hearing. Where teenagers are, and even up to today, are going to be apt to listen to new things, where older people don't want to hear new things. So the Beatles, which was even spelled incorrectly on the label, when they started to play the song, it kind of flopped because people weren't ready for the British invasion yet. And Biondi obviously knew what a big deal these guys are going to be. And, that, again, is a sign of somebody who not only understands the radio business and understands people business, they also understand what musical trends are coming in. He kind of put that in his back pocket, and obviously by the time he got out to L.A., he was the one that really broke them wide open for L.A. Sadly, it wasn't here in Chicago, but he still was the first to play it, as far as we know, here in the United States. And Pam, I think if I'm correct, I know that George Harrison's sister lived in downstate Illinois, and I believe she either had something.
Story about that.
Yeah,
But it's been proven that Dick is the first.
Yes, but that she had heard that he had played it, or so she kind of corroborated that story that he was the first.
Yeah, good. We're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, we could talk forever about this. This is so fun. But is there anything else, Joe, you want to ask before we go?
I could talk about this for forever. Just real quickly, Scott, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and your background a little bit.
Well, very good. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that.
Just got a couple minutes.
All right. I'll keep it as short as I can. So I got into the radio business, as I mentioned, through the domino effect back in the 70s when I started listening to WLS. And I originally wanted to be an architect, but then I realized that I was not very adept at the math. It was the design part that I liked better. So my other thing that I loved was music and radio, and I put that together and have been fortunate enough to work in Chicago all my life. Various stations in the city and the suburbs, doing everything from playing music to reading the traffic reports to doing talk radio. And I've been at it for 35 years, and WLS is the reason that I got into it. And it was when I wrote the book for Chicago's WLS Radio. Yeah. And even on the air today, as a matter of fact, and I'm still doing some work with our West Suburban stations, 95.9 The River and 1340 WJOL, which I will be on early tomorrow morning from 5:30 till 9. Yes. So
awesome.
Even during the pandemic, we're still working.
You know what? I realized I didn't get an autographed book.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to need that. So next time we get together, I'm bringing my book.
Me too.
But yeah, if anybody's interested, this book is available. Is it on Amazon, right?
Yes, it is on Amazon. Yes.
Or is it on your website too?
It is, but Amazon is the best place to get it. However, I do I do still do some public appearances, and when I do those, and probably mostly centered around the movie now, I do bring some with, so I do sell them on site as well.
Good. And this is a great book. It's got all kinds of pictures in it. Oh, yeah, look at Bob Hale back in the old days. Remember
You
Bob?
still look dapper.
Oh, yeah, he's so fun. Thank you
Great.
so much for being with us, Scott. This is so fun. And Joe, it's always good to see you, your smiling face. You
Oh.
made my day, guys.
Well, let me just say I'm so glad to be associated with this wonderful movie. You know, I have seen a lot of the clips, and I've been with both of you almost from the beginning, Joe, and certainly Pam. We met and I started to help collaborate on that, and nothing would make me happier than to see this either on the big screen or on the little TV screen as well. And I hope I see it on both, because
Yeah, me
the
too.
labor of love for you and everyone involved.
Thank you, Scott.
Right.
Thanks for
Thank
being
you.
part of it.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it, buddy.
We'll see you all soon. Take care.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
watching. Okay.